This is Bill Tinglin with Tour for Tolerance, proud sponsor of this podcast series on the Holocaust. Get ready. This week we take another powerful deep dive into history's darkest hour.
Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're time traveling back to Europe in the early 1900s.
Ooh, the belly poke.
Exactly. Think those lavish parties, groundbreaking art, all that jazz.
But underneath all that glitz and glamour,
There's a whole lot of tension brewing.
tensions that would eventually boil over into World War I.
And that's what we're diving into today.
Using chapter 1 of this fascinating history book as our guide.
We're going to try to untangle the forces that set the stage for this global conflict.
It's not just about memorizing battles and dates,
Right. It's about understanding the mindsets of the key players.
the ideologies that shape their choices,
And how, seemingly insignificant events.
that have such massive ripple effects.
So this book, it describes Europe at the time as this patchwork quilt of countries,
Each with its own unique culture and political system.
like a giant messy jigsaw puzzle.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's actually key to understanding the whole dynamic.
You've got these vast empires.
Like Russia,
Yeah, and Austria-Hungary.
alongside these smaller, rapidly industrializing nations.
Like Germany.
And what's really interesting is that while all these nations were unique
They were also super intertwined.
through alliances and rivalry,
And these connections, they were meant to, keep the peace, right?
in theory, yes,
In practice.
they kind of made war almost inevitable.
So we've got this mix of powerful empires and ambitious nations.
Right.
But at the same time, we're seeing the old world order of monarchies starting to crumble.
Absolutely.
The new ideas are emerging.
Democracy, nationalism, socialism.
They're all gaining momentum, offering these radically different visions of power and governance.
It's like the very foundation of Europe.
It was shifting beneath everyone's feet.
Exactly.
And two figures who really embodied this tension, at least according to our book,
Our Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany.
and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia.
Yeah, our book calls them the captains of their countries.
So let's talk about Wilhelm first.
Okay, so Wilhelm was determined to make Germany a global superpower.
Ambitious guy.
Oh, for sure. And his aggressive foreign policy, the military buildup,
Especially that naval arms race with Great Britain.
it really created a lot of anxiety among Germany's neighbors.
And then on the other side, you have Nicholas desperately trying to hold on to control of Russia.
Which was already on the verge of exploding.
Can you imagine the pressure?
I mean, Russia in 1905 was a powder keg, ready to blow.
The economy was struggling, people were demanding change.
And the czars just clinging to power.
And then, boom,
The 1905 revolution.
like a major wake-up call.
It exposed just how deep the cracks in Russian society really were.
It didn't topple the Tsar,
No.
but it did force some changes.
Like the creation of the Duma, their parliament.
It makes you wonder, though, right?
What do you mean?
If those in power had actually listened, heeded the warnings,
If they had taken those demands seriously.
could things have gone differently?
That's a question historians still debate to this day.
But one thing's for sure, though.
What's that?
1905, it was a turning point.
Yeah, a sign of the simmering instability.
Not just in Russia.
But across all of Europe.
And this instability,
It was just about politics.
it was about economics, too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
That growing gap between the rich and the poor.
The rise of labor unions, the demand for social justice.
It seems like so much was happening all at once.
Yeah, empires vying for power.
New ideologies challenging the old guard.
And everyday people just wanting a better life.
It was a time of immense change.
And upheaval.
And in the midst of all this chaos,
There was another struggle unfolding.
one that's crucial to understanding the whole picture of pre-war Europe.
The Jewish experience.
Our book, it takes us back centuries.
Reminding us that Jewish communities had really deep roots in Europe. They were often viewed with suspicion.
Treated like outsiders, despite, all their contributions.
To European culture, society,
They constantly faced persecution.
they were often used as scapegoats whenever things went wrong.
Imagine living in a place where your loyalty is always being questioned.
Your traditions demonized, your very presence seen as a threat.
That was the reality for many European Jews at the time.
And one figure who really recognized the severity of this situation was Theodor Herzl.
A Jewish journalist.
He witnessed the rising tide of anti-Semitism firsthand.
And he became a leading advocate for Zionism.
He was actually proposing the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
Wow,
as a solution to this deeply ingrained prejudice.
It's a powerful idea.
Imagine feeling so unwelcome in your own country.
that you dream of creating a new one.
That's the essence of what Herzl was advocating for.
Unfortunately, though,
Events would soon prove his fears justified.
the early 1900s saw this surge in anti-Jewish violence,
Including those horrific pogroms.
targeted at Jewish communities across Eastern Europe.
These pogroms were fueled by religious hatred, false accusations.
One of the most horrifying examples
Is the 1903 Kishinev pogrom in present-day Moldova.
It was sparked by a blood libel.
This completely unfounded accusation that Jews used the blood of Christian children.
In their religious rituals,
This pogrom resulted in the death of 49 Jews.
hundreds more were injured.
It's a chilling reminder of the depths of hatred and violence.
That can erupt when prejudice goes unchecked.
And it wasn't just the pogroms.
Jewish communities also faced, legal restrictions
Social discrimination.
that limited their opportunities and freedoms,
They were barred from certain professions, restricted in where they could live.
often subjected to quotas that limited their access to education.
These limitations were often justified by these harmful stereotypes.
That portrayed Jews as greedy, untrustworthy, unpatriotic,
It was like they were constantly facing an uphill battle.
no matter how hard they tried to succeed.
Sadly, that was often the case.
And a prime example of this is the Dreyfus Affair in France.
Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish army officer,
Was falsely accused of treason in 1894.
and despite overwhelming evidence of his innocence,
He was convicted.
sentenced to life imprisonment.
His case became this huge scandal.
It divided French society, exposing the anti-Semitism that existed even in a supposedly enlightened nation.
The Dreyfus Affair shows how prejudice can seep into even the highest levels of government.
And justice systems.
And while Dreyfus was eventually exonerated
The ordeal left deep scars.
on both him and the Jewish
It
community,
was a traumatic experience that would have lasting consequences
highlighting the deep-seated prejudice that existed in Europe at the time.
and would unfortunately continue to plague the continent for decades to come. So we've seen how Europe was this powder keg of, political and social unrest.
Right, all these tensions just simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly, and now we're going to look at how that fuse was lit.
Oh, here we go.
Our history book pinpoints 1914 as the year everything changed.
1914.
The year Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated.
That's the event that everyone remembers.
Just feels almost symbolic, right?
Yeah, the moment the clock started ticking towards war.
What's striking is that while the assassination was definitely a catalyst,
It wasn't the only factor,
it was almost incidental.
really. The underlying tensions were already so high.
That almost anything could have sparked the conflict.
Okay, so walk us through it.
All right, so who was Franz Ferdinand?
Yeah, and why was his death such a big deal?
Well, Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne.
So, next in line to be the big guy.
Exactly, and he and his wife, Sophie, they were visiting Sarajevo
When they were assassinated.
by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist.
And Austria-Hungary, they must have been furious.
Oh, they were outraged.
What was their response?
They saw this as an opportunity
To what?
to, assert their dominance.
Show everyone who's boss?
They issued Serbia a list of demands,
Like an ultimatum.
essentially, yeah.
It sounds like they were really trying to make a power play.
They knew Serbia was backed by Russia,
Oh, right, the alliances.
and they were gambling that Russia wouldn't risk a war to protect them.
But,
They miscalculated.
big time.
Serbia refused to comply with all the demands,
And Russia
honoring their alliance.
mobilized their troops.
It was on,
So now we've got Austria-Hungary and Serbia facing off.
and their powerful allies are stepping into the ring.
It's like watching a chain reaction unfold.
And then Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, pledged their full support.
They really jumped in head first.
They essentially gave Austria-Hungary a blank check.
To take action against Serbia.
It was a dangerous game of brinksmanship.
So everyone's on edge, ready to fight.
While some voices were urging caution, diplomacy,
It seems like nobody was really listening.
the prevailing mood was one of, intense nationalism,
And a belief that war was inevitable.
even glorious,
It's chilling to think about how the media was portraying war,
as this heroic adventure.
completely downplaying the potential for death and destruction.
It's hard to believe that people were actually enthusiastic about war. It just shows how easily public opinion can be swayed by propaganda.
And that nationalistic fervor.
And this sentiment wasn't limited to just one country.
Right, it was
A
everywhere.
fever for war, it was widespread.
So how did things actually escalate from like this standoff to an all-out war?
Well, Austria-Hungary, they declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914.
That's the official start,
Russia then mobilized to support Serbia.
which Germany saw as a direct threat.
So Germany declared war on Russia
When?
on August 1st,
And on France?
Russia's ally on August 3rd,
It's amazing how quickly things unraveled.
like dominoes falling, one after another.
And it all started with that assassination.
It's a stark reminder of how quickly events can spiral out of control.
And how interconnected the world really is.
And the tragic irony is that many people believe this would be a short war,
A decisive victory.
but that optimism faded very quickly.
As the conflict evolved into this gruesome stalemate.
Exactly.
So what made this war different from previous conflicts?
Like, what led to this stalemate? Well, the scale of this war was unlike anything the world had ever seen.
It was a global conflict.
New technologies like machine guns, poison gas,
Made the battlefields incredibly deadly.
and the strategy of trench warfare.
Led to these horrific conditions. And a prolonged stalemate.
Millions of soldiers were trapped in these trenches.
Facing unimaginable horrors.
The scale of the devastation and suffering is difficult to even comprehend.
And as the war dragged on,
It drew in more and more countries.
like who?
Well, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers.
And on the Allied side.
Japan, Italy, and eventually the United States
So what started as a regional conflict in Europe?
became a true world war, with battlefronts stretching across continents.
This brings us back to the Jewish experience during the war.
Right.
How did this global conflict impact their lives?
Well, the war was a double tragedy for many Jewish communities.
In what way?
They were caught in the crossfire.
Literally and figuratively.
They were forced to flee their homes.
Or serve in armies fighting on opposing sides.
Their loyalties were constantly questioned.
It must have been incredibly difficult to navigate those circumstances.
To feel torn between your country and your community.
And as if the physical dangers weren't enough.
The war also fueled a surge in anti-Semitism.
It's like during a time when unity and compassion were most needed.
Prejudice was thriving.
It's heartbreaking.
Sadly, this surge in anti-Semitism during the war would have lasting consequences.
How so?
It laid the groundwork for the rise of extremist ideologies.
That would ultimately lead to the Holocaust. We've covered so much ground here.
From the politics of Europe to the outbreak of war.
And of course, the devastating impact on Jewish communities.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
But I keep coming back to that image from the book.
The patchwork quilt of countries.
Yeah, it's such a fitting image.
It's not just about geography, is it?
No, it represents those complex relationships.
The alliances, the rivalries, the shared histories.
All connecting these nations.
Each patch is a different country.
But they're all stitched together.
You pull on one thread.
And the whole quilt unravels.
Which is kind of what happened, right?
Exactly.
The assassination of Franz Ferdinand.
This seemingly isolated event.
In Sarajevo.
It triggered a world war.
It pulled on that thread.
A whole system came apart.
So big picture.
What are the main takeaways from all this?
What can we learn from this period?
What's relevant to us today?
I think one of the biggest lessons is the danger of unchecked nationalism.
And militarism.
The glorification of war.
This relentless pursuit of national self-interest.
It led to a devastating conflict.
That ultimately benefited no one.
It's like they were all playing this dangerous game.
With incredibly high stakes.
And nobody won.
It's a cautionary tale.
Reminding us that cooperation, diplomacy,
and a commitment to peace
were essential for a stable world.
We're all interconnected, whether we like it or not.
And we also saw how social and economic inequality played a role.
The gap between the rich and the poor.
The lack of opportunity.
The persistent prejudice.
They all created this breeding ground for unrest.
And ultimately, conflict.
These are issues we're still dealing with today.
History shows us that these problems don't just disappear on their own.
We have to actively work towards solutions.
We can't afford to be complacent.
And finally, I think the Jewish experience during this time
offers a powerful lesson
about the dangers of scapegoating and prejudice.
Despite their long history and contributions to Europe,
Jewish communities were often targeted,
blamed for problems they didn't create.
It's a tragic reminder of how harmful stereotypes and misinformation can be.
They create fear and suspicion,
which makes discrimination and violence more likely.
It underscores the importance of critical thinking,
questioning assumptions,
and challenging prejudice wherever we encounter it.
It's been a heavy journey.
Exploring pre-war Europe,
but an important one.
The themes of nationalism, inequality, and prejudice.
They resonate even today.
Absolutely. Understanding this period isn't just about memorizing facts,
It's about learning from the past.
so we can build a better future.
So imagine you're standing in Europe in 1914.
The world is on the brink of war.
Could you have seen it coming?
Could you have imagined the devastation?
It's a question that challenges us.
To consider our own roles in shaping the future.
We can't change the past.
But we can use history to inform our choices
Advocate for justice.
and work towards a world where the horrors of war and prejudice
Are never repeated.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into pre-war Europe
It's been a sobering but essential exploration.
of a pivotal moment in history.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic.
So stay tuned.